I know. Copy. Sending it around. Oh, man, alrighty. All right. So I'm back. I can see that some of you, 7 of you, have rejoined. That is good news. I'm sorry for the inconvenience there. Computer just decided to run out of battery. Great time. But you might notice that here in this new live stream, eight of us. That's what's up. You've got live stream, so I'll say something there, and I got a few in the time that it took me just to get this running again. I can see that we've gotten a few emails with questions. That is great. I'm going to field a few of those right now to just get caught up, allow some of us to, tune back in. I did just send an email with the updated web link. I can see that you guys thought right. Just check your email immediately. I appreciate that. All right, we got a couple people. See, like they were in 9 viewers now. That's great. So anyway, just check into these questions. So from Joe Gleason, wondering what happens to the buds below the grafting joint. Will they produce branches from the original rootstock? Suckers? Dan and Joe Gleason, thank you for your question. That is absolutely right. So what we've got here is our grafted tree. Everything above here, and you'll notice that what I did trim this to size. I didn't even address that because I was in a tizzy getting my laptop plugged in. But what we have is 3 buds worth. That's as long as this needs to be, because the only growth that we're actually interested in keeping from this whole system is just growth from these 3. Now, everything, all the functional buds that are below the graft union will leaf out once this tree starts to grow, once you plant it. And so with those, as soon as they emerge, I just strip them off. And the reason why is because they're just going to sap away energy from this tree as a system. This tree has a finite amount of energy that it can funnel into new growth, because these roots are very new, they're very tender, and they don't have a lot of elbow grease yet. So as soon as you're sure that your graft has healed successfully, what you should see is these buds on the top above the union start to swell and then start to get leafy and produce leaf tissue. As soon as you even start to see them swelling, that is your green light to strip away any growth from below the graft union as soon as it appears. So that's a great question from Joe Gleason. Also have a question from Craig Brooker. Question is, if we are grafting in the field on rootstock that was planted 2 years ago, do you need to take off all the branches? And is the saddle graft the easiest or best cut? Okay, so that's a 2-part question. Firstly, if you're grafting rootstock in the field, so I'll just grab a different one and imagine like this is in the earth and it's growing. You're going to have leaves starting to come out all here. If you have a 2-year-old rootstock and there's actual branching on this, what you're going to want to do is find a section that is where find a section on this rootstock where you think you can get a good graft on, and that in order to assess that, the things you want to look for is a straight grained section that is free of knots. So anywhere where you have like a branch coming off to the side, that's going to have a knotted grain, and that's going to be pretty hard to drag a knife through. smoothly. It's not impossible. It's totally possible, and I can even go over some tricks for that if you need. But I would say cut off all the other branches and set the graft in a section of wood that's straight grained and free of knots. If you got a 2-year-old rootstock growing in the field that you're grafting on, this thing is probably pretty high, 5-6 feet. So if you can graft it anywhere from the ground all the way up. But as I said, especially if you're early on in your grafting career, I think that trying to find a place where you have roughly the same caliper between your rootstock and your scion is the easiest for beginning. Um, I am going to go over 2 more cuts now that we're all back here. And those are going to be 2 cuts that are a little bit better for situations when you're working with rootstock and scion wood that are different in caliper. And so I'll get to that, and that should help with that. And the last question that we've had so far, another one from Joe Gleason. Questions about scion preparation prior to grafting. So here we go. I'm going to get one of these just so we have our subject in front of us. For example, says the question, should the scions be soaked in water, brought up to room temp, snipped the end off before beginning the cleft cuts or whatever cuts, etc.? That's a great question. So preparing the scion wood it's important. So I have this is like straight out of a refrigerator. For me, I deal with a lot of scion wood every year. Some of you I have sent scion wood through the mail to, in order to keep all that scion wood stored over the winter. I actually have a mini refrigerator in my living room, it's hilarious that I have like 2 refrigerators in my house, but I just have a dedicated scion wood fridge. So it's really important to keep scion wood refrigerated at a cold temperature in airtight bags, and just making sure that there's no ethylene gas like there would be in your kitchen refrigerator, because any like lettuce or carrots or whatever you got in your fridge that are ripening, those are going to produce ethylene gas that can cause these buds to get leafy really fast. And that's obviously, as we said before, that's a death sentence for scion wood. So when you are ready to graft, what you're going to want to do is snip off the ends that have turned sort of brown. It might be hard on this stream to like see the color of what this is, but if you can see a difference between this color and then when I snip off the end, I'm not sure if you can see a difference between those two, but it should, now that the tip has been snipped off, it should look green and kind of vibrant. That's an important thing to assess whether the scion wood that you've harvested or that you're going to work with is still viable. If it's like brown or even like pale white, doesn't look very moist in there, then it's probably not super viable. But you don't need to do anything crazy like soak it in water. No need to do that unless it looks like it's really dry. At that point, it might be wise to try and soak stuff up. However, you don't want to do that for too long. You might want to do it for like a half an hour, maybe an hour at most, because the longer that you keep these in water, the longer this tree will think that the roots of it, and I say this tree, this is just a piece of scion wood, but remember, it was cut off of a living tree, and it's getting ready for springtime. So if you keep this thing in a glass of water, you'll just force the buds, and it'll in that way become unviable. So best thing you can do is to just not let your scion wood dry out after you harvest it, and then just pull it right out of the fridge when you're ready to go and just get grafting. So, okay, now we're caught up on questions. Again, thank you guys so much for bearing with me. I did not expect that to happen. That sucked. But I'm back now. We got the chat. So this is any questions going forward. Forget the email. Just put your questions right here in the side chat. I can see them instantly, and I can address it. And even if it's not a question, even if it's something you just want to go over, go for it, and we'll get it. So we're going to move on to grafting cut number 2 now. This is going to be the whip and tongue graft. Oh, and I forgot one last thing. On our graft that we did before, I didn't put the sealant on before we got cut off. And so my sealant is this kind of blue goop, as I was showing you before. You really don't need a whole lot to seal a graft like this, to seal a bench graft. The only place that moisture can escape from this whole system is through the top. You remember that I snipped off the top of this scion wood after the graft was complete to 3 buds. 3 buds is like as much as you're ever going to need to get a good healthy tree growing. And um, that snip mark is basically a chimney that moisture is just going to like escape out of. And so we want to just take a little dab of our blue goop and get it all over the top, give it a little cap. And so that cap is going to prevent the loss of moisture. It's going to ensure that we've got a good, healthy, safe graft. And then I'm just going to burrow this down into my bucket of graft, which has a bunch of potting soil and wood chips in it. Keep those roots nice and moist, because if your roots dry out, then you've also got issues. But that's pretty obvious. So I didn't need to spend too much time on how to keep your graft moist. Anyhow, grafting cut number 2, whip and tongue. So the whip and tongue graft, this is probably the most fundamental like grafting cut. It's the most widely used. It can be done really quickly. The advantage of the whip and tongue graft over the saddle graft or the cleft graft in bench work is that you can work with scion and rootstock that are slightly different sized by way of modifying this to like an offset whip and tongue graft. So I'm going to show you this 2 ways. We're going to do 2 whip and tongue grafts. This is going to be, I'm going to start with just like the regular whip and tongue with scion wood and rootstock that are the same caliper, because that's like the most basic and the most, that's the situation that you want to find yourself in. Obviously, working with scions from wild apple trees. A lot of you guys I know from wild apple thingies. So scions from trees that are growing in the woods, like they hardly produce vegetative growth on an annual basis. So sometimes you're working with like just super pathetic, tiny little grafting wood. So I see we got a couple questions in the chat. Craig says, "Why did you cut the top off the scion wood?" So I cut the top off the scion wood in the bundle because I wanted to just sort of like take, basically when you harvest this stuff off a tree and you store it for a long time, the end, it just kind of cures. I had this in an airtight like Ziploc bag, and it, at some point over the course of the storage, these ends, they don't dry out because they're in that bag, but they just kind of cure and they turn tan or dark kind of yellowish brown. So cutting that off just allows you to see if your scion wood's looking good or whatever. And then in the situation with this graft, I cut the tip off of that, if that was what you're talking about. I cut the tip off the scion wood on the grafted tree because having too much length, like if you were to graft a scion like this and get a good looking cut on there and you stick it on, if you were to leave all this bud on here, the roots, which are pretty wimpy at this point, they're not going to be able to really push out a lot of growth on every single one of these. It's dividing the finite amount of energy of the root system between all these different points. So by cutting it down to 3 buds in length after you finished your graft, you're basically you're gonna make a more lively tree. So I hope that answers that question. And Stefan, is offset saddle graft a thing? Yes, absolutely. Offset saddle graft is a thing. If you have really small scion wood like I was talking about, you can do the saddle graft just fine. However, I think that it's actually much more difficult to get that that symmetrical like wedge cut on a really wimpy piece of scion wood with a real with that cut. It's going to be easier to work with wimpy scion wood doing the offset whip and tongue graft, or even the Z graft, which is the next one I'm going to show you. And then the second part of your question was, is that aligning to one edge of the joint? Exactly. So because the cambium layer, when you cut the rootstock. You know, if you make that cleft down the middle and you pry it open, you have basically two channels of cambium, one on one side, one on the other. And so by taking a skinny piece of scion wood and aligning it just to one side and getting that 50% alignment, that will be just fine to get a good graft. However, it's a little more the union will be stronger in its eventuality of being like a big, healthy, mature tree, if and only if you get that callus to envelop the whole thing eventually. So getting a couple other cuts in your repertoire can help with basically just getting strong unions, because one thing that can happen with grafting is you're just starting out, if you're always doing that that offset on either the saddle graft, which we covered, or doing this offset whip and tongue graft. If you're in a place that gets a lot of wind, if you're in a place that gets a lot of birds like landing on your grafts, sometimes in the like couple of weeks to months after setting these grafts out in the garden or out in the orchard, they can actually get blown off their graft union. And so that's like the one reason why I want to show you these other ones, because it's a big world out there. You got owls trying to hunt for mice in the orchard or whatever, and if they land on that tender graft before it's really gotten a lot of grip on both sides, this kind of lateral movement might bust it. So I hope that helps to put that in perspective. But yeah, just aligning one side it's gonna heal just fine. And then last one before I get going, I promise. Can you use extended parafilm wrap instead of sealant and wax? Yes, you can. Instead of capping the tip of your graft with the sealant, you absolutely can just use a little strip of that parafilm tape to seal and stretch over the top. That'll work just fine. I like using the wax for whatever reason, the sealant that I told you the recipe for. That's just my style, but you do whatever works for you, especially because it's a lot of liquid. It can be expensive if you're buying like it in the bulk sizes that I described to you before. So anyhow, that's that. On to the whip and tongue, my friends. On to the whip and tongue. So again, first things first, get your rootstock ready. And by doing that, I'm going to cut it down to size just a little bit. So this is a two-part graft in a way. There is the whip, and then there's the tongue. There's a lot of ways you can go about this, but in general, the whip part comes first on both the rootstock and the scion, just to make sure that we've got a consistent overlapping of that cambium. So the whip cut is basically the goal of the whip cut is to just get a symmetrical oval in the profile of the prepared rootstock and the prepared scion wood. So what I mean by that is by making a diagonal cut. So just by taking the knife and going diagonally through the wood like that, you should be, if it's a symmetrical, perfect oval, you should be able to just do that in one swift motion and get this nice oval profile. So again, my grafting grip is to put the stock in my first digit with a little bit of overlap here, and then have a free thumb to help work the spine of the knife. And so that's what it's going to look like when you're right-handed and you're in position. So take that knife, somewhere down the scion wood where you have room to work, and then just take this hand and drag it through the wood. I'm going to be giving you guys like some, what I hope are like verbal advice, so that it can help you with doing this now that we're not really in person. So here is my first whip cut. There we go. You see that dead on. So it's not a perfect oval. It's pretty good. I guess I could clean it up a little bit and just make it look perfect for you guys, so that you get the idea. That's looking better. So there is my whip cut. So I like this because we've got a pretty symmetrical oval. The pith, which you should be able to see, is right in the middle of the wood. Now, if that's like up or down in the space of this, then you might want to try and keep doing this cut. Just, if you redo a whip cut, then just start just beyond your starting point of the first one. And the way that I like to, like for safety's sake, hold my hands, my arms, with the knife in this hand, cutting towards you. So this is my right hand, cutting with the edge of the knife that way. I like to hold this arm, like this, sort of the meat of my wrist, just like press it against my rib or something, so that I can have one, like, so that I want to lock this whole system up and only be moving my knife hand. This is a moving system in ways that, other simpler grafting cuts aren't. Like the saddle graft, you're just sort of like, pushing this down and wiggling it. It's a little bit more of a moving system, this cut. So I like to just lock my hand against here with my stock. The knife hand only be moving along here so that I have as few joints moving as possible. A lot of times when people are just getting the hang of this whip cut or the whip and tongue graft, I see a lot of like wrist motion, like moving this way, and that's going to be an issue because the way that you assess whether this cut was flat, and I mean flat, is by taking the edge of the knife and just putting it against there. Now, if you can see light passing through, then you've got a wonky cut. But if that knife edge reaches, if it just lies totally flat on here, then you're in business. And so I'm not sure how close of a view I'm going to be able to get that, but if you just take the knife, the edge of it, and place it flat against the whip cut that you've just made, then you can tell if it's flat. If it's not, when you end up joining the scion and the rootstock, you're going to end up with, kind of a mismatch, or that there's not going to be that marriage contact of the cambium, which is reliable, which we rely on for a healthy graft. So now what I'm doing is I'm selecting a piece of scion wood to try and make a symmetrical cut that'll fit on top of the rootstock. So looking for a piece of scion wood in my bundle that looks, pretty equal in size. And because this is a big bundle, I've got a lot of choices. So I'm just going to, here we go. This one looks perfect. So here we go. You've got this as your guide. And so along here, again, I'm going to be looking for a place on the scion that looks like we have, a good clear runway. Sometimes when you're working with certain scions or certain varieties that have different growth habits, they can look a little like zigzaggy at sometimes. This happens to be a very straight growing variety, but finding an area on your scion wood, no matter when and where you're working, that that has like a really straight pattern. Sometimes that's like starting above a bud. So there's a bud. If you just like start your cut above that, that can be a good way to cut through a clean, straight section of scion wood on a wiggly variety. However, again, this is a pretty straight one, so I'm not going to spend too much time pushing pencils over that point. And again, we're going to lock our left hand or left arm against a rib or something on your torso that feels like you can just sort of brace the stock, the scion stock, without having any movement that'll be inflicted on the system by you dragging the knife through it. And then again, sort of a gorilla grip in the right hand and trying to get a nice, long, sloping oval cut. If I do a few tries like I'm doing right now, like I just did, every time I start again, I'm going to start right behind the starting line of my last cut. And so that'll help you just maximize how many tries you get out of a single piece of scion wood until I feel like I've gotten two ovals that are the same length and will fit together nicely. So I think I've got a match here. Put my knife down and just show you what I've got. So here we go. I've got two ovals that look like a good match to me. This one might be just a hair shorter, but it's okay. Again, the length is not quite as important as getting the contour and the profile of this oval to be pretty similar. So when you've got two whip cuts, you're off to the races. Now we get to do the tongues. Now this is where it gets a little interesting. The whip cut is basically the, you know, that's like 90% of it. And the tongue is a locking mechanism, which helps to hold the scion wood and the rootstock together, which is a great thing because that compression, the cut itself, notwithstanding the compression you're going to add from parafilm, notwithstanding any kind of support that you're going to do, like tying the little graft link to a stake or something, getting that tongue cut in there, that locking mechanism. Oh man, fire truck. Hold on, it's going to be loud for just a second. All right, that's better. I'm not sure if you guys can hear that, but it's pretty loud over here. So anyway, getting that tongue cut and that locking mechanism is going to help create a stronger union overall that's going to prolong the life of this baby tree. So the way that you cut this tongue, instead of, you can sort of see that angled profile of the whip that we've cut on the rootstock. The other one should be pretty much the same angle. Instead of cutting the tongue at that, at that diagonal angle, it's actually going to be going straight up and down, parallel with the grain of the wood. And so the way I'm going to hold it this way so it's easier to see. But the way that I do that, again, holding in the same digit, you're going to have your thumb able to sort of move about freely. And start, I have to redo this angle to show you the tongue effectively, but I hope you can see this. Let's see. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So again, this is a little bit hard to show you the way that I'd like to, but we're going to be trying to just make a little incision into this wood, not at the angle of the whip cut, but directly parallel with the grain of the wood. So that's straight up and down. And just making a little slit into the wood so that we can basically lock these two pieces together. Now, you should be able to see the knife that I just jammed in there. That'll stay right there. It's strong. So what I've got here is a finished whip cut on the rootstock. We need to do that on our scion, which I have conveniently lost track of. Nope, found it. And then lock them together. And so this is kind of like I'm conscious that it's not easy to see exactly what's going on there. But I will back up and do this again. So now that we've got the whip and the tongue cut in both of them, you have to slide these two together, making sure that the notches, those tongues that you just incised into the wood, make a nice marriage. And this is eventually going to heal and look like the Harry Potter scar that the dude has on his forehead. It'll look just like that lightning bolt shape when you're done. So that is what you want to be at. That's where you want to see this graft finish up. It's going to go like up and then down and then up again. And so we should have nice alignment so that you can almost not even tell that there is like a union there. It should look pretty inconspicuous, just like, regular old tree, not grafted or nothing. Just kidding. But if you can see the cambium when you're inspecting the union after you're finished, that means that your alignment might need to be adjusted. Doesn't mean you necessarily have to redo the cut, but just adjusting the alignment while or before you're wrapping it is important. So I want to make sure that you guys get the handle on, no pun intended, on cutting those tongues, because that's probably the most tricky thing. So I'm going to just redo just a scion wood. I'm not going to bother with the rootstock for this. I'm just going to show you my method for getting that tongue cut aligned from a knife grip standpoint. So here you've got a tongue or a whip cut, and you can see that in the middle of that you'll see the pith. The pith is that hollow, kind of foamy, superficial tissue in the center of a scion. And so the reason why I'm mentioning that is because it's just a visual marker, but when you're cutting the tongue, it really helps to know exactly where the center is, because you have to obviously, along the face of this cut, it's like if you start your tongue a little too high and you end it a little higher than you did on the reciprocal one, when you finally meet the try to mate those two, it's not going to line up quite right unless you know exactly where your pith is on your scion wood and exactly where the pith is located on the rootstock. So this pith here is like it's kind of brown. It's kind of dark in color. It's a little hard for me to see. Maybe you guys can see it just fine. Let's see. Yeah, that you see that dark pith. So what I'm going to do is cut a tongue again to change my grip. Black backdrop would help, I think. I'll remember that for next time. Okay, sorry. This is crazy. So again, I'm holding this in my first digit, and I'm trying to like rotate my hand because I'm looking at this backwards, but I'm sure it looks relatively normal to you all. I'll make this easy. When you have this grip, you want this to be facing like the same direction as your fingernails. And so when you're actually cutting this, it's going to be facing you. So the exposed whip cut, that's going to be facing you. And then with the, your grafting knife, with the ground edge, not the flat edge, but the ground edge facing you also, start at the tip of the pith. So the pith, again, is that sort of that long brown section right in the middle. You're going to start right there and end right there with the tongue. So you're basically going to cut a tongue that is the length of that exposed pith. So I'll try to do this backwards, even though it might not work as well as I planned. You can see that I'm using my thumb just as a little bit of a guide, and I'm just going to wiggle back and forth with this to make sure that we're getting the right kind of travel there. So again, that's a pretty workable, serviceable tongue. We got Nathan Shackelford says, great tip about where to start the tongue cut. Oh, good. I'm glad that makes sense. That's just something that I wanted to throw in because it's like it's not essential for me to tell you. If you do this a few times, you're going to get the hang of it just by trying it out and trying to fit them together and saying, oh, why is it not fitting just right? But that's something that I like to try and keep my eyes on. So glad it worked as a tip for maybe a couple of you. So with this cut, this whip and tongue cut, I would just say practice it a bunch of times. Get a bunch of like junk scion wood that you're, not your like precious wild apple bittersweets that you want to, really do a nice graft on. Just get some Macintosh water sprouts from like your neighbor's tree or something, and just like practice this over and over again. Practice making that whip cut, and just do like whip cut after whip cut after whip cut until you feel like you've gotten that perfect oval, just like like you're automatic with it. That will really make a difference, because this again is like, it's just as much about knife skill and muscle memory as it is about understanding like what you're looking for. So I'm going to do another whip and tongue cut now, but I'm going to do like a little bit of a different style with it. I'm going to do an offset whip and tongue, and that is just going to be the difference with that and the one that I just showed you, is that the offset is when you're working with stock that's like, disparate in size. So I'm going to try and get a really, really huge Mondo beefcake rootstock. This is a pretty fat one, if you can see that. This is about 3/4 the size of my pinky, so that feels pretty significant. Not to be intimidated by. Trimming my rootstock down to size once again, so I can get the feel just right. And first, just start by making my whip cut on the rootstock. So again, bracing this against my belly and just rip it one swift motion. Put the knife up and make sure that I've got a nice flat union. Can you guys see that? There's like no light passing through. It's just flat. There's no wobble in the cut. And my pith is, see the camera angle, it might be hard to see, but it's right in the middle of this oval. So now that I've got my rootstock prepared, I'm going to try and find a piece of scion wood in this bundle that's a little smaller and show you what it means to offset this whip and tongue cut to one side. So I'm going to get a piece of scion wood that's significantly smaller in diameter. So just to show you, here's our match. This here is probably about, if I had to guess, 3/16 of an inch thick. So that's pretty thin. Some of the scion wood that I work with is like much thinner than that, like 1/8 at most. And that is even that thin on something like this can work with the offset whip and tongue cut. The trick is just getting the right kind of alignment with your reciprocating piece. So just go back to geometry class for a second. Sorry, I didn't need to drop all you. That was not cool. So back to geometry class. If you are to take an oval, two ovals of different sizes, and you just cut them in half down the middle, you'll have a semi-oval or a semicircle on one side and a semi-oval or semicircle on the other side. Basically, you're just looking at one of those sides for this offset whip and tongue graft, because we know that we're not going to be able to align on both sides, because this is just quite a bit thinner than this. So if we're thinking with that in mind, to make a cut on here that is going to match up with one side of our receiving stock. So the first thing to do is to just try and make a cut that's equal in length. So I'll line them up, and it looks like if I'm going to make a good cut on my rootstock, I need to start it, or on my scion wood, I need to start it right about there. And get it nice and long. So doing my best to keep it nice and straight. And guess and check is totally allowed. So we'll see how do those look. It looks like this one's still a little short. Go back, tune it up, make it a little bit longer. And let's check it now. Those look pretty equivalent to me. So I'm going to roll with that. Now you can do the same thing. Cut your tongues just the same way. So you got a thumb to work with. You've got your scion wood gripped in the correct hand, and you just sort of use this thumb to help press the spine of the knife downward, starting the cut at the top of the pith, ending it below the pith, trying to go as parallel with the direction of the grain of the scion as possible. Do the same on our big Mondo beefy rootstock. And again, with my scion wood now prepared for a union, I'm just going to cut it down to size. We need three, there you go, three buds, three functioning buds to get a good take here. And now we'll take our prepared scion. You've noticed that it has become quite small now that I've trimmed it. That's all right. We're going to try and get these two to meet up just right. So what you should be left with at the end is something that looks a little like this. So you see what I mean, how you've got this oval, and we're really only concerned with that side of it. And the reason why is because it's just not going to be possible to get this thing to line up on the whole side. But because our cambium is located just right between where my finger is and the tip of our scion wood, and it extends in the profile of that oval just underneath the thin, tender outer bark, you're going to be able to get a good alignment just by chasing that one side up. So look at the union all around, make sure that you've got good alignment. And once you feel like you can see that lightning bolt just right, it meets the sort of bottommost apex of the profile of that cut on the rootstock, then you say, all right, looks like it's good enough. I'm going to tape it up. So this is another little tip that, pro tip that you won't hear from just anybody telling you about whip and tongue grafts. But if you're doing the offset whip and tongue graft like this, even the offset saddle graft, like Stefan was asking about earlier in the chat, which you can refer back to if you need to review that question. But it's always helpful when you're doing an offset like that to tape it with the excess tape being wrapped around in the direction of that alignment rather than taping it with the excess in this side. The reason why I point that out is because if you are stretching this tape and proceeding around in circles with it, you're going to be pulling that graft out of alignment if you do it from the wrong side. But because you're wrapping around that smooth face, which you can check for good alignment by just running your finger on it, and if it feels smooth, if it doesn't feel like there's any texture to that side at all, you've got good alignment. The sort of compression of wrapping it in that direction around, that will really help to shore up any inconsistencies that there are on the wrap to begin with. So I am going to wrap this one just by, again, pulling a little bit and then twisting the tree around and around and around. And so we'll get to the end of this one and then seal it up quick. I believe I actually didn't remember to seal up the last tree that I did too, so I'll put some sealant on the cap of that one. And then we'll get on to grafting cut number 3. So there we go. We've got another wrap. So you can see like through the tape that, you can still see the exposed face of that. And even though this tape, like, it transmits light, it's not a problem. This is going to take off. It's going to grow, no problem. So if you have any situations, you guys out there, where you have a really big rootstock that came to you in your package from Treeco or wherever, Cummins Nursery, Fedco, whatever, and it's like way bigger than any scion wood that you have to graft with, you're going to want to do the offset whip and tongue or this next cut that I'm about to talk to you about. So the next cut is called the Z graft. Um, and the Z graft is called that because it literally looks like a Z. It's like Zorro. It leaves that kind of Z in its, as the shape of the graft scar that'll form. Just like we had the Harry Potter looking one, you've got one that looks just like Zorro's mark. And it's a grafting cut. Oh, just excuse me while I wrap and tape up the regular whip and tongue. But I'll just tell you a little more about the Z graft. It's a grafting cut that's very popular with citrus growers. So if any of you guys live in like the South or anywhere that's warm enough where you can grow citrus, and you have any citrus trees in your garden, or if you yourself have grafted citrus trees, the Z graft might have been used. I don't know why it's like the preferred cut in citrus grafting, but it's just something that I learned about that cut recently. I thought was pretty interesting. um, and also, I'm just going to check into the chat box really quick. Got a couple questions. Dan Gleason says, any thoughts on using elastic on the outside of the paraffin wrap for extra support? Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, a lot of grafters, a lot of folks use stuff called buddy tape. And what buddy tape is like, it's actually for summer budding. It's like almost like a rubber band that's cut, and that does add extra support. The compression that the parafilm tape should have, if you did a good job wrapping, should be absolutely fine. You could, when you do this yourself, you'll even like take two grafted trees and like pretend they're drumsticks. You shake them around, bang them on stuff, and you'll realize that stuff it's really strong. You're not going to have too much trouble getting a strong union with a um, well taped graft union just using the parafilm. So that's my 2 cents. I don't really go harder than that. You can if you use the grafting sealant on the caps of your grafts, you can actually paint over the tape, the parafilm. That helps to keep things like really visible too, so you know exactly where the graft union on a certain tree is. That's something that I like to do. So it's up to you. I think you'll be fine either way as long as you just like are very vigilant about wrapping tightly. And from Chase Roshan, we've got a question. How old do you prefer your rootstocks to be when you choose to graft onto them? That's another good question. The way that I've been working in my nursery for the last 2 years, or 3-4 years, God no, at this point, is that we'll plant rootstock in the nursery and grow it out ungrafted for a whole year, and then actually graft it in the field 1 year after it was planted. The reason why I feel that way is because it's not like a size of the rootstock thing. That is something that you'll have to deal with, and these extra cuts help to figure out what to do when you've got really thick scion wood that's grown out for a little while. Thick rootstock, I mean, that's grown out for a little while. But when you consider what grafting is, like you're like doing some serious wound trauma to this apple tree. And in order to really get a good looking grafted tree off the ground, it does help to have like an extra year of growth on the rootstock where it's building its root reserves. And additionally, I'm gonna be sending you guys some grafted trees that I'm gonna be doing these grafts right now and sending them out next week. But those trees are gonna, I would recommend planting them in a pot or in the ground like right away when you get them, because they're going to be overcoming transplant shock in parallel with overcoming this like graft union trauma. So it's like a personal thing. I like to have rootstocks 1 year old in the nursery grafted at that point, because they have already overcome that transplant shock. That's not another setback for them. But part of that concern is that I'm trying to grow like good quality saleable nursery stock, good saleable quality apple trees, and that's not everyone's goal. But that's my 2 cents there, so I hope that helps. So, finally, Zorro cut, the Z cut. This is a very interesting looking cut for one, and this is pretty much like the ultimate when it comes to grafting rootstock of a different size than your scion would. So again, I'm going to take like a pretty mondo beefy rootstock and a really really wimpy small piece of scion wood and show you how to do this one. So it's a 2-part graft, just like the whip and tongue, except you're moving each part to a different part of the scion wood and rootstock, or a different part of the stock that you're working with in general. So I'll show you the way that you prepare the rootstock for this Z graft first, and then I'll get to the scion wood after because it's easier to see on this big target. So you're going to make 2 whip cuts, one on the rootstock and one on the scion wood, just like you did with the whip and tongue cut. However, the difference is that with the whip and tongue graft, a long very nice long oval is the thing that you're looking for in that cut. However, in this cut, you want a very short oval. And the reason why is because that whip cut is not going to be the primary face of cambium contact. We are going to cut a tongue, or not really a tongue, but just a little strip on the side of this stock opposite the short whip cut that we're going to first make in order to get that primary face of cambium overlay. So first, the short whip, even the first one that I just cut was a little long. This is kind of where I want to be. So this is like a pretty, relative to the thickness of this piece of rootstock, it's a pretty short, pretty short oval. I guess when I bring the laptop to me, that's much easier to see how wide this thing is. So that is the first thing that I want to make. Once you've got that, you're going to take your scion wood, which is going to be a positively wimpy little thing. So in our case, I'm going to use a little piece of scion wood from my bundle that's like this thick, like very thin compared to our mondo beefy rootstock. And the way that we prepare this is by making the same kind of whip cut at first. It's going to be short, and it's going to look like it's longer. That looks relative to the thickness of this. Looks like it's kind of average long looking oval, but when you put these things side by side, they should be more or less equal, but it's a shorter oval than the whip and tongue graft, at least what you're aiming for. So the whole thing about what I was saying about the primary cambium overlay part is going to be down the back side, so the opposite side from here. So to prepare that, you're actually going to have the back facing you. You're looking at the exposed whip cut, but in order to actually do this, you're going to take the same kind of hand grip. So, dock that digit, having a thumb to play with, and we're going to cut from the top of here down the back side of the scion just to basically the bottom of here. And we're going to cut really, really much closer to the back side than to the front side. You're just going to be cutting a thin, thin strip down the back. So I'm going to demonstrate that and show you what it looks like when it's done. But the way I do it is to, use this thumb to sort of gently coax that knife along until you can wiggle it until you're just to the place that you want to be. So what you should be left with is like a tiny little strip, just like that. And it's like flapping in the breeze. It's that wimpy. So I'm going to do it again, just to make sure I've got another one that looks just like it. On another piece of scion wood here. This is just because I kind of want to have two to choose from, because the first one I didn't do super great job on. This one looks better. So, can you see that? How thin that strip is? It's pretty flappy, but what's cool about it is that when you do this flap, you're actually getting more cambium available to you, even in a smaller package, than you are with the Pippins hung graft, for example. Now, the reason why, go back to geometry class, is that any of you who have ever seen like a bandsaw mill take a tree trunk into boards before, you probably have an easy time visualizing it with that metaphor. But if you imagine like a whole tree trunk that's going to get milled into boards, the first slice that a sawmill will take, like you've got the tree trunk profile view there. If you're going to take boards off, going downward, the very first slice that you get is going to be like a lot of bark, maybe a little bit of wood, but mostly bark or whatever, because that rounded top surface is basically the barkiest part that you're going to be taking off if you make those consecutive slices like that in the direction parallel with the grain of the tree trunk. In that first slice, you're going to get all the cambium that's directly under that bark. So if you apply that same thinking to the Z cut, when you make that slice down the back side of this, you're just basically inserting a scion into like pure cambium. And I will disclaim here that it's definitely a more challenging cut to master. But when you have a piece of scion wood that's like tiny, 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 and like a big mondo piece of rootstock like this, it's the best way to get a really strong union. So what you want to be trying to do is to, this thing that we just cut, you want to be trying to make a strap on the rootstock that matches the strap on that. And so it's going to take some very careful knife skill, and just take your time. Don't rush through it. I'm just carefully dragging this knife through the wood. The rootstock that I'm using here is Budagovsky 118. And what's nice about Budagovsky 118 or Bud 118 is that it is a red fleshed variety. And so it's cool. If the color balance was better on this computer screen, you'd be able to see how different it is than the color of our scion wood, which is just green on the inside because it's a regular green leaved apple. But anyway, so what we have here, we've got what I think should be a good match. So the way that you slide them together, rather than, again, we're not using the whip cut as the primary form of cambium overlay. It's the back strap there. No butchery, kind of pun intended there, back strap, ha ha ha. So anyway, you're gonna slide them together like this so that the strap of one is aligned against the back of the other, and then the little flaps that you cut, those are gonna go down the center of the whip cut on the other. So I hope that wasn't, this is like a really hard thing to describe verbally. What I'm doing here is just elongating the strap on this one because I didn't make it quite long enough at first to make it down the whole face here. But now that we have that is a Z cut. And so I'll hold this up, but there's the Z for Zorro. And if you spin it around, you can see that there should be no visible cambium layer, but right in that pocket right there, that is like, that's going to heal up very, very nicely. So at this point, you're ready to tape up your Z-graft. And another disclaimer here that the Z-graft is a much more, it's tender. You really got to be careful when you're taping it because it can be knocked out of alignment easily due to the fact that this locking mechanism is nowhere near as sturdy before you tape it as the whip and tongue graft's locking mechanism. So word of caution there. If any of you guys received a package of Scion wood from me, in the mail in the last couple of weeks or a month or so or whatever, there's a chance that you may be getting some Scion